In this episode, I'm joined by David Turner, Distillery Manager at Bowmore Distillery on the Isle of Islay. Great to see you, David.
Welcome. I'm good, thanks. All good.
I only wish that I was over at the distillery just now with you, having this conversation in person. It's one of my favourite places in the world to be.
Yeah, unfortunate with the uncertain times we're living in, you can't travel over to Islay, but it's great we've got virtual and we can get Bowmore seen to the consumers out there as well. So it's not great, but we can live with it and we've got other ways of working, which is fantastic.
Of course, you usually have a lot of visitors at the distillery, unfortunately something I imagine not able to do so much at the moment. But have you managed to keep production running at the distillery?
Yeah, we were stopped for a couple of months just for production in April and May, and then we've only lost 2 months production. So we're back in full production. We're not doing tours or tastings just now, but the retail shop is still open for visitors to come and visit the shop as well. So we're living with what we've got and we're doing quite well. And it's all about keeping people safe and hopefully to welcome everyone back when the pandemic's over.
And of course, the most important bit is that the spirit's still flowing and you're still making great whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. The spirit's still flowing through, the spirit's safe. The maturation is going well and we're keeping all our staff safe and well. That's our number one priority, and we're still selling to consumers and they're coming in safely as well.
Now, I've been drinking Bowmore whiskey for about as long as I've been drinking whiskey at all, so it's a distillery that's very close to my heart. But for those of our viewers at home that aren't so familiar with the whiskey that you produce in the heart of the Isle of Islay, tell me about the history of the Bowmore distillery.
Bowmore was founded in 1779. We're the oldest distillery in Islay, the second oldest in Scotland. We've got one of the few handful of distilleries that still have our own malt barns, so we produce about 30% of our own malt on site. So we believe all the Bowmore characters start out in the malt barns, they get carried right through the process. We've got semi-clear wort coming through, we've got longer fermentations, slow distillation, and we spend good average more than whisky companies in buying good casks. We believe if you've got good casks, good new make spirit going into it, you'll have good whisky at the end. Our maturation warehouse, the number one vault, it's the oldest maturation warehouse in the world. It's the Scotch oldest maturation warehouse in the world. It dates back to 1779, so it's part of the original building.
So you've got this wonderful heritage at the distillery, the oldest working distillery on the Isle of Islay, this incredibly historic site, this very traditional way of doing things. For you, how does that all come together? What's the spirit style, the real character of Bowmore's whiskey?
Bowmore's handcrafted. We traditionally handcrafted 1779. The handcraft tradition is passed down from generation to generation. So we're still handcrafted. When everybody thinks of Islay whiskies, they think of really peated whiskies. That's not always the case. Traditionally, on the north of Islay, the whiskies are very, very lightly peated. On the south, they're very heavily peated. Coincidentally, Bowmore sits on the middle of the island, and coincidentally, we see ourselves or call ourselves, we're a midly peated Islay whisky, or we see ourselves or call ourselves a mid-ranged or a perfectly balanced Islay whisky.
So you mentioned how you feel it's a real handcrafted spirit that you make at Bowmore, and a key part of that is the fact that you have your own floor maltings, and it's something that most distilleries, all of their malt comes from third-party maltsters. Very, very few do what you guys do and actually malt a proportion of your barley on site. Tell me, why do you think it's important to keep those floor maltings active at Bowmore?
Bowmore's well known for the whiskies to have the tropical fruit flavours. When Bowmore gets to 17, 18-year-old, the ripe fruits start turning into tropical fruits. At 15, 17, 18-year-old, the peat smoke tends to die away. The peat smoke gets lighter or camouflage as the fruits turn from ripe to tropical. We believe that all the tropical fruit notes that Bowmore's well renowned for start out in the malt barns, and these flavours are carried right through the process to the end product, the whisky in the bottle.
So you're saying that key spirit character, that tropical character, for you that starts at the floor maltings, and without that part of your production process you wouldn't be getting that spirit style?
No, they mainly come from the floor malting. The yeast types that we use two different types of yeast for the fermentation as well, play part of that to the fruity flavours. But no, the tropical fruit notes all start out in the malt barns, where the barley's hand turned every 4 hours, day and night. It's on the floors for 5 to 7 days, depending on the time of year. And we use the Islay peat for peating it. So no, the tropical fruit notes get carried right through from the malt barns.
So you mentioned your 3 different types of yeast you're using there. Let's talk a little bit about fermentation. How long do you allow that process to go on for?
We ferment for 66 hours. All our fermentations are 66 hours. We use a cocktail of yeast. We use 25% of Kerry yeast and 75% of Maori yeast. We believe that the 2 different types of yeast, they work slightly different as well. The Maori starts working at the beginning of the fermentation, the Kerry works more towards the end of the fermentation, and the cocktails of yeast give us the right flavours we're looking for in the fermentation as well. Also, we ferment in wooden washbacks, so the tropical fruit flavours come from the wooden washbacks for fermenting as well.
So for you, while that tropical character is starting out in the floor malted barley, and without that floor malting process, you feel you wouldn't be getting that same tropical note. It's in the fermentation and that's really happening then. That's where you can really start perceiving it for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. When we're doing a general mash, we usually use about 25% of our own malt in the mash with the commercial malt, so they're carried through together. Or a few times a year, we do some trials making spirit with 100% floor malt. We've been doing that since 2016, so there's some interesting spirit or whisky to come from Bowmore in the near future.
Well, that's definitely something I'll be looking forward to then. So you've created this fermented wash that's ready to go through to your stills. So let's talk about distillation at Bowmore Distillery. Tell me about the shape of your stills and the way you run them. How do you create that signature style of spirit?
We're double distilled like most distilleries in Scotland. We go through the wash distillation first, and then we go through the spirit distillation. Bowmore stills aren't too high. The lin arms are slightly pointing up the way, and we run each still in about 16 to 18 litres per minute, so only the finest and lightest of vapours get over the neck and into the still and collected as a new make spirit. So we run the spirit quite slowly at 16 to 18 litres per minute.
So tell me about your cut points then. Some people watching this might be familiar with the fact that many Islay distilleries and distilleries that generally produce peated styles, they have relatively low cut points, as that allows them to capture more of the phenolic character of the spirit that's coming from the stills. But obviously at Bowmore you don't have quite those heavy iodine notes that some people might think of when they think of peated whiskey. It's a very elegant and fruity style. So does that mean that you guys cut slightly higher?
We've got a wee longer, we've probably got a possibly longer foreshot than everybody else. We run our foreshots, the first part of the distillation, for 35 minutes. We cut on spirit about 74%, and we take it down to 61%. So the average strength for our new make spirit is about 69.0% alcohol by volume. Yeah, so the cut points make slightly different for the flavours coming through as well.
So once you've got that new make spirit, then how would you characterize it? This is before it goes into the cask. How would you describe that new spirit?
Our new make spirit, you get you get the floral notes coming off it, the fruity notes. It's fresh. You get the slight peatiness in Bowmore, and you get like different characters coming from it as well. It's quite fresh. You get slightly smoky, nutty, slightly fruity coming off the new make spirit as well.
I completely agree. I've been lucky enough to try the spirit for myself at the distillery, and you're completely right. It's got this wonderfully, wonderfully complex nose, and you can really see that by putting this super characterful spirit into cask, that's the key stage in producing that signature Bowmore style. But obviously maturation is incredibly important too, and you mentioned having a very important warehouse at the distillery, the oldest in the business. So tell me a little bit about that maturation on site. How does the environment come into play when it comes to maturing Bowmore whiskey?
Our number one vaults is right on the Atlantic coast. It's right just out from where we're sitting here just now. In here, the building dates back to 1779. It's big, thick stone walls. In there, the temperature never really changes from summer to winter. It's always 6 or 7 degrees in there all year round. So it's perfect conditions for maturing the casks. The casks are slightly porous. They take in flavours from the surrounding areas they get matured in. Also, it gives off the angel share, the evaporation. We lose 1 to 1.5% contents each year to the evaporation. But the cold, damp temperature all year round is perfect conditions for maturing our whisky.
So that presumably means you're able to mature spirit in that warehouse for very, very long periods of time on account of that incredibly stable environment.
Yeah, absolutely. We released a 1957 54-year-old a few years ago. That's the oldest Bowmore that's ever been released. Actual fact, it's the oldest Islay whisky that's ever been released, and it was matured in the number one vaults. So we've got good age stocks dating back to 1970 maturing in the number one vaults just now.
So you mentioned Oloroso sherry casks there. Now, I recognise that as a key component of Bowmore's whiskies today, but is that something that has been the case throughout your whole time at the distillery and even before that? What role have sherry casks played in Bowmore's history?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been using sherry casks. Well, the famous Black Bowmore, they were matured in refill sherry casks, so we've been using them since 1964 or previous to that as well. So, yep, we fill a high percentage of bourbon and we fill a smaller percentage of sherry as well.
So you're still filling both styles of cask at the distillery?
Yeah, absolutely. We mature in both styles at the distillery, yeah, for our different bottlings or different styles of whisky.
So tell me, we've talked about the heritage of the distillery itself, but what about you? How did you come to be the distillery manager of Bowmore?
My mother's cousin's husband was a distillery manager, and I was 16 years old back in 1990. And when I left, he offered me a job, so I left school to come here at 16 back in June 1990. So I started off in the warehouses when I was 16. I went to the malt barns when I was 18. I worked my way through to the still house. I've been doing the day-to-day running the distillery since 2007, and I became the distillery manager on the 1st of August 2012. So I've worked through all the processes.
So you've had a hand in every different part of the distillery then?
Yeah, absolutely. I started off in the warehouse, malt barns, mashing, distillation. Yes, I've done them all. Yeah.
And tell me, when you were first starting out in the industry, did you enjoy a whiskey then?
No, I was a wee bit too young to drink whisky at 16, but my grandfather used to work here, and I remember I was 8 years old when he passed away, and he had a bottle of the Bowmore Bicentenary, and his wish was to open that the day he got buried. So they opened the Bicentenary when he died, and I always remember smelling the whisky, and that was my first insight to whisky. And I always remember smelling the tropical fruit notes way back then when I was 8 years old as well.
Wow, so you've got some really strong childhood memories of whiskey there, and does it play a big part in the community as a whole? Do a lot of people on the island drink a whiskey?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people enjoy the whisky. Yeah.
So you've obviously had this incredible career in the whiskey industry, this incredible time at Bowmore Distillery itself. But tell me, after all these years, is there a particular part of the production process that still particularly gets you excited that you'd say is your favourite?
When I started first on shifts, obviously I was working in the warehouse till I was 18, but I started off in the malt barns. The malt barns always interest me. Every time I go in there, I can still smell the smells from the day I started working in here. And in my heart, the malt barns is the main part of the character of the Bowmore whisky. All the fruity flavours, the tropical fruit notes that Bowmore's renowned for, all these flavours start out in the malt barns. So in my heart, the strongest place I believe is the most characteristic to the Bowmore whisky is the malt barns.
Yeah, and I hear from speaking to a few people at the couple of distilleries that still do floor malting that there's a real knack to it, and there's a real skill to getting that right, and particularly there's a real skill to running the kilns too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's about getting the peating levels right and getting the germination times from summer to winter, spring, autumn, change all the time. Yeah, it's a handcrafted and it's passed down through generation to generation. So it's important to get the flavours right, yeah.
Exactly, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't appreciate about distilling, which is that you really have to react to your environment and particularly to the weather, and tweak the process every day, every time the weather changes, to make sure you're consistently producing exactly the same style of spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. From summertime, we have the floors germinating for 5 days, autumn, spring, 6 days, and the winter 7 days. So it can change from 5, 6, 7 days when we're germinating the barley. So no, it is an act, and it's handcrafted, and you learn that through generation to generation.
Great. Well, I know you have a dram of the 15-year-old Bowmore there with you, and I think you're definitely, after all this talk, you're definitely deserving of a dram. So let's move on to talking about that.
Yeah, we've got the 15-year-old, part of our core range. The 15-year-old, in my honest opinion, is a fantastic dram. This has spent the first 12 years in bourbon casks, and it's been finished in first fill Oloroso casks for the last 3 years. So from the bourbon casks, I always believe you get the true Bowmore distillery character coming through in the bourbon, and you get the richer, fruitier flavours coming through in the sherry. So you can see the colour is like warm mahogany colour. If you have a wee smell, you get the distinctive Bowmore smokiness. You get the fruitiness coming through from the bourbon cask, but you get the dark sherry, caramel, toffee, fruit notes coming through from the sherry. This one's really creamy. It coats the front of your tongue, and then you get the distinctive Bowmore smokiness in the background. You get like the vanilla flavour from the bourbon. You get like raisins, sultanas. It's like a rich Christmas cake. This is a fantastic winter dram, a great Christmas dram, one to enjoy sitting beside the fire in the winter time. In my honest opinion, I think the 15-year-old is fantastic value for money. You get the true distinctive character there, and the slight Bowmore distinctive smokiness in the background.
You're completely right. I think there's definitely quite a lot of people out there that will say that they got into drinking whiskey off the back of the 15-year-old Bowmore, and I agree again with you that it's a very, very keenly priced dram and a real great winter sipper.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But you still get the true distillery character from the first 12 years it's spent in the bourbon casks as well. So we haven't lost the distillery character finishing it for 3 years in the first fill Oloroso sherry. The distinctive character's still there.
And if you had two casks of whiskey, sort of before they'd been put together to make that dram, so you had one that's 12, 13, 14 years in a first fill bourbon barrel, and you had another that was for a similar period of time in an Oloroso sherry cask, how would you characterize the differences between those two spirits after those two distinct styles of maturation?
The bourbon would be much lighter and fresher, where the sherry's much darker and richer. So you can see the difference totally from the influence of the casks it's been put in as well.
And there's something else going on at the moment that I know is very exciting, and I'd love you to tell me a little bit about it. It's this new collaboration with Aston Martin, which I understand means that you get a Distillery Manager's Aston Martin to drive around the island.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're in partnership with Aston Martin, two premium brands. In my opinion, they fit totally perfectly together, and we're both premium. Bowmore is one of the most collectible and most desirable single malts out there. I think we are sitting at one of the most collectible and most profitable single malts. We've got great age stocks dating back to 1970 maturing in our warehouse. We do good vintages of different ages every year. So yeah, it's a great partnership with Aston Martin. We've got the first bottling coming out. It's the end of Q1 2021, the DB5 edition, which is really smart and something to look forward to.
I was looking at some pictures of it the other day and it's looking absolutely fantastic. And you mentioned there the Black Bowmore series. For those at home who aren't familiar with it, can you tell me, what was that particular release?
The Black Bowmore, when the Morrison family bought over the distillery in 1963, it was still coal-fired. So they invested heavily doing away with the coal-fired stills and putting in a steam boiler. So the boiler was first run in 1964, and one of the first distillations of the steam boiler was laid down in refill sherry casks. It was laid down in November 1964. And back in 1993, these casks were getting monitored all the way through the years. But when they went to bottle this in 1993, the whisky flavour was amazing and the colour was black, as in the name Black Bowmore. So we knew we had hit something really good back then. Collecting whisky back in 1993 wasn't as popular as it was today. So when they'd seen the colour and quality of the whisky, they decided to put it in nice presentation boxes and make something special of this whisky, hence the name Black Bowmore. So we released 2,000 of these in 1993 at a 29-year-old, 2,000 bottles in 1994 as a 30-year-old, and it was 1,812 bottles in 1995 as a 31-year-old, and that was a series. There's still some casks left over. We released another one, 42-year-old, in 2007, and we released the last one, the 5th edition, in 2016 as a 50-year-old. So there's 5 different editions of the Black Bowmore. The whisky is black, as in the colour, and it's like the tropical fruit notes in the sherry cask is fantastic, and they're one of the most collectible single malts in the world.
I've actually been lucky enough to taste this new Black Bowmore release myself, and I completely agree. It's absolutely fantastic. It has all these wonderful, rich sherry cask notes in there, but also, I mean, overwhelming tropical notes. It's full of papaya and mango and pineapple. It's incredibly, incredibly rich. It's very, very special.
Yeah, absolutely. People don't believe how strong the tropical fruit notes, especially as the whisky gets older to over like 30-year-old, it becomes stronger and stronger, and the peat smoke camouflages behind it.
So I know that you have some limited edition and some distillery exclusive expressions in the pipeline coming up. So tell me, what can we expect in the next few years?
No, I think it's just one to keep an eye out for. We do different limited editions each year. We do some that are exclusive to the distillery and some are worldwide, but we've got some interesting whiskies maturing in our warehouse. We've been doing 100% floor malt trials since 2016, so that'll be an interesting release to come in the future. But no, all I say is keep drinking Bowmore. The best Bowmore has still to come.
I know that recently as well there was a new distillery exclusive release that was announced. So can you share a few details about that?
Yep, we released the David Simpson, the Founders Edition. This was released about 6 weeks ago. This is only available from the distillery shop. It's a limited edition of 6,000 bottles. It's bottled at 50.7%. It's a 20-year-old whisky. This spent its first 15 years in Oloroso sherry casks, and it was finished for the last 5 years in PX, Pedro Jimenez sherry cask. This is really good value for money. It's £220. You can see from the colour, it's dark, it's rich, it's got the distinctive Bowmore smokiness, it's got a lot of characters and flavours in there. This one's selling really, really well. It's becoming popular for collectors and connoisseurs. This one is a collectible whisky, obviously, but it's still good drinking value at £220 a bottle. This one is really worth trying and buying.
Yeah, and I was lucky enough to actually have a dram of this before release, a little sample to see what it would be like, and I was absolutely blown away by it. I think it's really, really fantastic liquid, and as you say, it's a very reasonable price for what you're actually getting in the bottle.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a really good value, and it's selling really, really well.
But all that leaves me to say is thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today about Bowmore Whiskey, and all I can say is I hope that I'll be over there visiting you again soon, sooner rather than later.
Yeah, absolutely. We welcome everybody here once the COVID situation's over. We look forward to welcoming everybody back at Bowmore and sharing a dram with them. Cheers. Slàinte.
Cheers. Thank you very much, and see you soon.